There were opium dens where one could buy oblivion, dens of horror where the memory of old sins could be destroyed by the madness of sins that were new. The opium den, with all its mystery, danger, and intrigue, appeared in many Victorian novels, poems, and contemporary newspapers, and fueled the public's imagination. It is a wretched hole, so low that we are unable to stand upright. Lying pell-mell on a mattress, placed on the ground are Chinamen, Lascars, and a few English blackguards who have imbibed a taste for opium. So reported the French journal Figaro, describing an opium den in Whitechapel, 1868. In 1857, the Second Opium War resulted in the Treaties of Tianjin, which included a clause allowing Britain and France to recruit Chinese to the British colonies, North America, South America, and Australia as cheap labor. In the mid-1880s, Chinatowns started to form in London and Liverpool, with grocery stores, eating houses, meeting places, and in the East End, Chinese street names. The London press, along with popular British authors of the day, were fond of portraying London's Limehouse district as an opium-drenched pit of danger and misery. In the 1860s, dark England with its opium dens in London's East End was described in popular press and books. Various individuals and religious organizations began to campaign against unrestricted opium trafficking. Using opium was once described as having the keys to paradise. So compelling and delicious was the experience. This comment was made by Thomas de Quincey, who wrote the famous Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821. It's perhaps no surprise then that this substance had become increasingly popular in both Britain and China by the 18th century. 18th century China rivaled Britain in its addiction. Britain was addicted to tea, and in fact the nation had transitioned from a country centered around alcohol to new luxuries: sugar, chocolate, and tea. The whole country went through a cultural shift from drinking the more common beer and gin to the exotic and newly available tea. So how was Britain going to continue to pay China for all of its tea? With opium. Britain had very little that China wanted in terms of goods, and were hemorrhaging silver in order to pay China for their tea and feed their habit. Their trade with China had become dangerously uneven, with China having far more control over the situation than Britain. China had become known as the graveyard of silver because of the propensity of the precious metal that was used to pay China for goods at the time, and not just by Britain. Here is a French satire from the time showing an Englishman ordering the Emperor of China to buy opium. A Chinese man lies dead on the floor with troops in the background, and the text says, "You must buy this poison immediately. We want you to poison yourself completely because we need a lot of tea in order to digest our beefsteaks." Opium was not actually introduced into China by the British. The drug had been in China from as early as the 5th century. Brought by the Assyrians, Greeks, and even Arabs as an ancient medicine, opium has been used as a painkiller for centuries and was taken in pill or liquid form. In 1773, Britain was the leading seller of opium, and the British product, grown in expansive poppy fields from their Indian colonies, was also known as the finest quality worldwide. So there was enormous demand in China for it. However, by 1796, the emperor made the trade, importation, and cultivation of opium illegal. This meant that the East India Trading Company could not legally bring opium into China. This did not deter the British, however, and instead other trade ships were used to transport the substance to smugglers who could then illegally bring it into the country, essentially using an elaborate network of smuggling pirate ships. By the early 19th century, more and more Chinese were smoking British opium as a recreational drug. But for many, what started as a recreation soon became a punishing addiction. Many people who stopped ingesting opium suffered chills, nausea, and cramps, and sometimes died from withdrawal. Once addicted, people would often do almost anything to continue to get access to the drug. By 1836, the Chinese government began to get more serious about enforcing the 1813 ban. It closed opium dens, executed Chinese dealers, but the problem only grew worse. The emperor called for a debate among Chinese officials on how to best deal with the crisis. In the end, Lin Xu's side won the argument with his aggressive policies. He attacked the opium trade on several levels. He made rapid progress in enforcing the 1813 ban by arresting over 1,600 Chinese dealers, seizing and destroying tens of thousands of opium pipes. He also demanded that foreign companies, British companies in particular, turn over their supplies of opium in exchange for tea. When the British refused to do so, Lin stopped all foreign trade and quarantined the area in which these foreign merchants were confined. After 6 weeks, the merchants gave in to Lin's demands and turned over 2.6 million pounds of opium, which is about 20,000 chests. Lin's troops also seized and destroyed the opium that was being held on British ships. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston then officially initiated war with China. 16 warships made it to Hong Kong and the war began, but it did not last long. China was simply no match for the might of the British Navy, which at the time was unrivaled around the world. After the war, China was forced to sign the August 1842 Treaty of Nanking. This became famously known as the Unequal Treaty, or the first of the unequal treaties due to the severe bias in favor of the British. The Chinese essentially paid for the fleet turning up to fight them. They paid for the burned opium. Hong Kong, although often referred to as the Barren Rock at the time, was given to the British, and British councils were even allowed into China, which was previously then a very closed country. The results of the First Opium War was that things very much returned to the status quo. Britain kept smuggling opium into China, and the Chinese kept smoking it, and China kept sending tea to the UK. This relationship was tenuous at best, however, and it would not be long before the issue escalated once again. The Second Opium War in 1856 commenced after the British declared a Chinese seizure of a transport ship suspect of salt smuggling a violation of the Treaty of Nanking. This war prompted the intervention of other countries aiming to pick on Great Britain due to their massive empire and control and monopoly on the trade. The British and French captured Beijing and forced on China a new round of unequal treaties, indemnities, and the opening of 11 more treaty ports. Due to China's loss in the Second Opium War, China was forcibly made to legalize opium. In 1860, British and French troops landed near Beijing and fought their way into the city. Negotiations quickly broke down, and the British High Commissioner to China ordered the troops to loot and destroy the Imperial Summer Palace, which is the garden where the Qin dynasty emperors had traditionally handled the country's official matters. At the end of the 19th century, of a population of 300 million Chinese, 90 million were addicted to opium. The Chinese emperor fled to Manchuria in northeast China. The war ended with a greatly weakened Qin dynasty that was now confronted with the need to rethink its relations with the outside world and to modernize its military, political, and economic structures. When the opium dens reached San Francisco in 1864, the police, despite occasional crackdowns when low on funds, never seriously menaced the opium trade. The police, who occasionally did find themselves short of funds, encouraged the passage of anti-drug legislation with tirades about the evils of opium. George Walling wrote, "Reveries, dreams, and stupefaction do not come with one pipe. Again and again the smoker cooks his lump of opium, packs it into the bowl, and lazily watches the smoke curl up around the lamp. After a while, the pipe drops from his nerveless hand, and there is a glaze on his eyes which are half shut like a madman's. His head falls upon his breast, and he is in the opium trance which is either a paradise or hell, according to the degree of his indulgence in the narcotic." The clergy at the time also chimed in. A reverend described a San Francisco den. The air is sultry and oppressive. A stupefying smoke fills the hall, through the gloom of which the feeble yellow light of 3 or 4 opium lamps struggles hopelessly to penetrate. There are 2 or 3 wooden beds covered with matting, and each is furnished with lamp and pipe. 3 Chinamen lie in different stages of stupefaction. The room is about 15 feet by 10 feet. Ceiling and walls black with years of smoke. We have been in this den about 5 minutes, and no one has spoken a word. It is like being in a sepulchre with the dead. In the 1880s and 1890s, local laws of ever-increasing severity attempted to stop the flow of opium and prohibited Americans from visiting opium dens. San Francisco's reputation as America's capital of opium debauchery stimulated the city authorities to at least take cosmetic steps. A handful of Americans were jailed, and by the late 1890s, as the laws grew more severe, fewer and fewer Americans visited the dens. In the late 1880s, the San Francisco Call estimated there were about 300 opium dens in the city, serving the roughly 3,000 hardcore hopeheads or opium fiends, along with the countless others who indulged less immoderately. The opium dens bore red signs above their doors, reading "pipes and lamps, always convenient," in Chinese calligraphy. The opium dens were finally wiped out in the earthquake and fire of 1906. Most were never rebuilt, and the few that lingered were put out of business by the nationwide drug crackdown a decade later. In a public event that took place sometime around 1920, San Francisco police confiscated opium in the middle of a rebuilt Chinatown. The event was apparently worth photographing several times as well as attended. To our eyes, the public burning may represent many things: the formal display of civic authority, the ritualized expunging of sin, the vigilant surveillance of Chinatown streets, the symbolic punishment of vice in the public sphere. But what was burned was not the body of a particular sinner, but the recalcitrant body of underground Chinatown itself. The burning gave ceremonial form to the claim that the new tourist quarter, like the old, was still ridden with vice, despite the appealing pagoda lamps and colorful streaming banners.